The wind in Texas carries dust the color of old blood. September of 1876. The border country between Laredo and the Rio Grande. A man stood on a flat stretch of caliche and broken rock, and the sun hung behind him like a copper coin nailed to the sky. His name was Calvin Rourke, 34 years old, tall, lean as a fence post that had weathered too many winters, a silver star pinned to the leather vest he wore, and that star caught the light when he breathed. 20 paces in front of him, another man waited, Silas Thorne, younger by a few years but already gone gray at the temples from the kind of life he had chosen. His left shoulder was wet with blood from a bullet Cal had put there an hour back in a chase that had run 6 miles through mesquite and bone. Silas was not going anywhere on horseback now. The horses were dead, both of them, shot out from under their riders in a flat exchange of fire that had left 2 animals folded in the dust like discarded coats. So it had come down to this. 2 men, 2 pistols still in their holsters, the wind, the sky, and a debt 7 years in the making. Silas spat blood into the dirt. He smiled. He had the kind of smile a wolf has when it knows the hunter has only 1 cartridge left. "Cal Rourke," he said. His voice was hoarse from the dust. "You think that piece of tin on your chest gives you the right to judge me? You think a man can wear a star and not become the thing he hunts?" Cal said nothing. The wind moved his coat. "I am going to do my time ranger. Maybe 7 years, maybe 10. But I will come out. And when I come out, I am going to find you. I do not care if you have gone to Montana. I do not care if you have gone to the moon. I am going to find you, and I am going to take everything you love. Slow. The way you took mine." Cal's voice, when it came, was quiet and dry as the country around him. "I buried my wife last month, Silas, and my little girl beside her. I have not got anything left to take." For a moment, just a moment, Silas Thorne's smile faltered. He saw something in Cal's face that he had not expected. Not grief. Something colder than grief. The face of a man who had already walked through hell and come out on the other side with nothing left to lose but his own life. And in that moment, Silas reached. But Cal was faster. 2 shots, so close together they sounded like one. Silas spun sideways and went down hard on his bad shoulder, screaming. His pistol skidded across the rock. He clutched his belly with both hands and watched red bloom between his fingers. Cal Rourke stood for another second. Then he reached up and touched his own chest. His fingers came away wet. He touched his right shoulder. Wet. He looked down at his left thigh where his trousers had gone dark. 3 bullets. He did not even remember Silas firing the 3rd time. He knelt slowly. The dust rose around him like a small private storm. He set his pistol down. Then, with stiff fingers, he unpinned the silver star from his vest and laid it on the caliche beside him. He stared at it for a long time, the way a man stares at a thing he has carried too long and finally cannot carry any more. "I am done," he said to no one. "I am done." The wind took the words and gave nothing back. Far-off hooves were coming. The other rangers were coming. Silas Thorne was crying now, cursing alive but ruined. Cal Rourke sat in the dust beside his silver star and let the blood run, and the title rolled across the sky like distant thunder. The last oath of a Texas Ranger. Wyoming Territory. The autumn of 1883. 7 years had passed. In the back room of a brick row house in Philadelphia, a woman stood in an empty parlor and watched 4 men carry her piano out through the front door. The piano was a Steinway walnut with brass pedals worn smooth by 20 years of music. Her husband had bought it for her on the 3rd anniversary of their wedding. She had played Chopin on it the night their first child should have been born, the child that never came. She had played it again the night their second hope died inside her. She had played it the morning her husband Edmund first put a bottle of laudanum in his coat pocket and pretended he had not. Now 4 men in canvas aprons carried it out into the rain. Her name was Margaret Ashford, 43 years old. People had called her Maggie once when she was a girl in a different city, in a life that no longer existed. Her hair was still dark, but a thread of silver ran along her temple now, like a road on a map. Her eyes were green and tired. Her hands, which had once been soft, were beginning to learn what hands could do when there was nothing left to lose. She watched the piano disappear into a wagon. The sheriff's clerk handed her a paper and asked her to sign it. She signed it. He tipped his hat without looking at her and went out. The house was very quiet then. She walked into Edmund's study. The shelves had been emptied. His medical books were gone, taken by the auctioneer. His instruments were gone. His diplomas were gone, sold for the gilt in their frames. The room smelled of the cigars he had stopped smoking 3 years before he died. And underneath that, very faintly, of the bitter brown medicine she had pretended for so long. She could not smell on his breath. She opened the drawer of his desk. It was empty. She reached to the back of it and pressed her hand against the wood. Years ago, when Edmund had been drunk and weeping in his chair, he had told her about a small space behind the drawer where he kept private papers. He had laughed about it. He had called it his confessional. She had thought he was making a joke about money. Her fingers found the catch. A panel slid aside. Inside was a leather ledger no bigger than a hymnal. She took it to the window where the light was better. She opened it. Pages of names. Pages of dates. Pages of numbers written in Edmund's careful doctor's hand. Some entries were ordinary medical orders, pharmacies, dosages, patients. But other pages, the later ones, the ones written in the last 2 years of his life, were different. The patients had no names, only initials. The amounts were enormous. 100 bottles, 200 bottles, 300. And in the margin, beside many of these entries, always the same 2 initials in a tight, hurried hand. ST shipped El Paso. Ship Galveston. Ship Wyoming Special, no questions. Maggie did not know what any of it meant. She did not know what ST was. She felt a cold spread through her chest, the cold of a thing she could not name but recognized as wrong. She thought of Edmund in his last months, the way he had jumped at footsteps in the hall, the way he had triple-locked the door at night, the way he had stopped sleeping at all near the end, the way he had been found dead at his desk one Tuesday morning with an empty bottle and a note no one had ever seen him write. She slipped the ledger into the deep pocket of her morning dress. 3 days later, Edmund's brother arrived at the house to inform her that the family wished her well, but had decided that given the scandal, it would be best if she did not call on them in the future. He left her with a single banknote and his condolences in a closed door. That afternoon, she walked to the public reading room of the library because she could no longer afford a newspaper, and she sat at a wooden table and turned the pages of the Philadelphia Daily Ledger looking for, she did not know what. And on the back page, between an advertisement for a hair tonic and a notice about a missing dog, she found it. Rourke's Bend Ranch, Cedar Falls, Wyoming Territory. Cook wanted. Room and board provided. Inquire Briggs General Store. She tore the corner off and folded it small and put it inside her glove. She did not know yet that the initials in Edmund's ledger were the same man who had been waiting for 7 years to come for the man who had placed that advertisement. The train west took 6 days. She slept sitting upright in second-class cars with her carpet bag between her knees and Edmund's ledger pressed against her ribs like a wound. She slept one night on a bench in the Chicago depot because she had calculated wrong, and a porter let her stay because he said her face reminded him of his mother. She washed her face with cold water in train station basins. She ate bread and hard cheese, and once an apple a brakeman gave her. She read the advertisement so many times that the paper grew soft and her fingerprints darkened the corners. By the time the stage rolled into the long dust west of Cheyenne, she was thinner than she had been in Philadelphia. The shadows under her eyes had deepened. But something else had begun to happen, too. With each mile, the country grew larger and the air grew colder and emptier, and the weight of what she had left behind grew lighter. There was no one on this stage who knew her name. There was no one between here and the Pacific who knew about Edmund. For the first time in 3 months, she could breathe without the sensation of a hand closing around her throat. The stage was nearly empty by the last leg. Only 2 passengers, Maggie and a stout, gray-bearded man in a brown coat who sold whiskey to the territories. His name was Donnelly. He told her so in the first hour, and asked her with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised by women where she was bound. "Rourke's Bend," she said. "It is a ranch near Cedar Falls." Donnelly did not answer for a long moment. The stage rocked. The driver above them whistled to the team. Maggie watched the man's face and saw something pass across it. "Ma'am," he said finally, "forgive me. Do you know whose ranch that is?" "A Mr. Rourke. They told me he needs a cook." Donnelly took a slow breath. He looked out the window at the rolling tan country. Then he turned back. "Mrs. Ashford, I am going to tell you something, and I am going to ask you not to repeat it. I knew of Cal Rourke when I lived in Austin. He was a Texas Ranger, the kind they wrote about in the papers. They called him the man who brings justice. He arrested 47 men in 8 years. 5 of those men went to the gallows. He chased the worst of them, and he caught them every one, except for one." He paused. "The one he did not catch, he shot 3 times, in a stretch of caliche near the Mexican border. But the one he did not catch was harder than 3 bullets, and he lived, and he went to Huntsville prison instead of the gallows. And the day they took that man away, Cal Rourke laid down his star. Some say he died. Some say he went into the mountains. Some say he became a ghost. But here you are telling me he is in Wyoming and he is hiring a cook. Maggie's hands had gone very still in her lap. "Why are you telling me this, Mr. Donnelly?" He looked at her steadily. "Because Cal Rourke carries lead in his body that should have killed him, ma'am. 2 pieces in the chest and 1 in the leg. Doctors said he should be dead. He is not. And a man who is not dead, when he should be a man who walked away from a fight he won and laid his star in the dirt, that man is carrying a different kind of weight. He is not gentle. He does not laugh. And somewhere in some town, somewhere, a man named Silas Thorne has been counting the days until he gets out of a cell and goes north." The stage rocked. Maggie did not look away from him. "You are walking into a house that has a ghost living in it, Mrs. Ashford. I am telling you because no one else will." She thanked him quietly and said nothing more for the rest of the ride. When the stage rolled to a stop in front of Briggs' General Store at Cedar Falls, the late afternoon sun was throwing long shadows along a single rutted street. There were perhaps 15 buildings in the town. A saloon called the Iron Horse, a livery, a blacksmith, a small wooden church with a bell that rang the hour, a boarding house with a sign that read Holloway's, and at the center of it all, the general store. Maggie stepped down from the stage in her black mourning dress. The dust met her immediately, settling on the hem on her shoes on her sleeves. Men outside the saloon looked at her. They did not whisper. They simply looked the way men in country like that look at anything new. She went inside the store. Amos Briggs was a thin man of 60 with wire spectacles low on his nose, sorting nails into wooden bins. He looked up when the bell jangled, and what he saw made him set down his pail. "Ma'am," he said carefully. "Help you." She pulled the worn newspaper clipping from her glove and laid it on the counter. Briggs looked at it. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at it again, the way a man looks at a thing he hopes will turn into a different thing if he stares long enough. "This advertisement," he said, "has been up for 2 months. 3 women have come for it. All 3 left within 4 weeks. One of them walked out into the prairie alone rather than spend another night at Rourke's Bend. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Maggie looked at him without flinching. "Mr. Briggs," she said, 3 months ago I buried my husband. 3 months ago I learned that everything I owned belonged to other men. 1 month ago, I slept on a bench in a railway station in Chicago because I did not have the money for a room. I do not have the luxury of being afraid of a ranch. Please, speak plainly with me." Amos Briggs took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. For a long moment he was silent. "Cal Rourke," he said, "is a fair man. He pays an honest wage. He does not raise his hand to those who do not deserve it. He keeps his word. But he is not a soft man, Mrs. Ashford. He has lived 10 years in a house where no woman has stayed past 3 weeks. And it is not because he is cruel. It is because he is wounded in a place where you cannot see the wound." He paused. "The worst of his hurts, ma'am, is not in his body." "I will go," she said. He nodded slowly like a man who had expected this and was sorry. "The supply wagon leaves at dawn. You will need clothes that can stand the work. I can sell you what you need. And Mrs. Holloway runs the boarding house. Tell her I sent you. You can stay there tonight." She bought 2 calico dresses, a pair of stout boots, a wide-brimmed hat, a heavy shawl, and a small tin box of needles and thread. She paid with nearly the last of her money. Briggs wrapped everything in brown paper and tied it with twine. At the door, he stopped her. "One more thing, ma'am. If you take this job and you stay, you may at some point hear things about Cal Rourke. Stories from Texas. Names. Numbers. Things that sound like rumors. I will tell you this. He earned every bit of his reputation, and he paid for it. Do not be afraid of him. Be afraid for him. There is a difference." She did not understand his meaning that day. She would understand it later. That night at Holloway's, she sat by a small window in a small room and watched the street empty as the lamps were lit. Widow Holloway brought her a bowl of stew and a piece of brown bread, and did not ask her business. It was past 10 when Maggie pulled back the curtain and looked out into the dark street and saw him. A man stood at the far end of the road in the deeper shadow, where the lamps of the saloon did not reach. He was tall. He wore a long oilcloth coat. He was looking up at her window. She could not see his face. She did not move. She did not breathe. She watched. He stood for perhaps a full minute. Then he turned and walked slowly without hurry into the dark beyond the saloon and was gone. Maggie let the curtain fall. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, before the sun was up, she climbed onto the seat of a supply wagon beside an old man named Pete Sawyer, who did not say more than 3 words to her in the first hour. The team pulled out of Cedar Falls and turned northwest. The country grew. The town vanished behind them. The prairie opened in every direction, brown and golden, scattered with sage, and the mountains rose pale and distant on the far horizon. They drove for almost 5 hours. When they came over a low ridge, she saw Rourke's Bend for the first time. It sat in a natural bowl of land sheltered by hills that rose on 3 sides. The main house was built of squared logs and rough planks, 2 stories solid as a fort. Beside it stood a large barn, 3 corrals, a long bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and a chicken coop. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. Horses stood in the paddock. Men in dust-colored shirts moved between the buildings on errands she did not understand. There were no flowers. There were no curtains in the windows. There was no softness anywhere. It was a place built by a man who needed work and shelter and nothing else. Pete reined in the team in front of the house. "Wait here," he said, and climbed down. "I will fetch him." She sat on the wagon seat with her 2 carpet bags and her brown paper package, and her hands folded in her lap. The wind moved her shawl. And then he came out of the barn, Cal Rourke, 6'2", broad through the shoulders, dark hair beginning to gray at both temples, though he was not yet old. A thin scar across the jaw. He moved with the slight unevenness of an old leg wound, but he moved like a man who had decided long ago not to let it slow him. He wore a faded blue shirt and a leather vest and a wide hat pulled low. His eyes, when he reached the wagon, were the color of cold iron. He stopped at the bottom step. He did not climb up. He did not offer her his hand. He looked at her for a long moment, taking in the dust on her dress, the carefully tied package, the green eyes that did not look away. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. His voice was deeper than she had expected, and quieter with the faintest weather of Texas still in it. "Mr. Rourke." Mr. Briggs sent word. You understand I need a cook, not a lady. Mr. Rourke, I understand you need someone who will not run. I have nowhere left to run to." He absorbed this without expression. "Have you cooked for 15 men? No. Have you killed a chicken? No. Have you carried a 40-pound bucket of water from a well in winter? No." His mouth tightened slightly. Not a smile. Something just short of it. "Then what makes you think you can do this work, Mrs. Ashford?" She lifted her chin. "I have stood beside a drunk surgeon while he operated on a child. I have sewn a man's hand closed when he fell down a staircase. I have stood in a courtroom and listened to creditors read out my name as if it were a sentence. I do not know how to kill a chicken, Mr. Rourke, but I have learned harder things than that. I am willing to work." The wind moved between them. Somewhere a horse snorted. Cal Rourke looked at her for a long time, and then, with the smallest motion of his head, he nodded. "1 week," he said. "If you do not run within 7 days, we will speak again. Pete will take your bags." He turned to walk back to the house. Then he stopped, and without turning all the way around, he said one more thing. "Mrs. Ashford." "Yes." "This house forgot how to laugh a long time ago. I do not care if you can fix that or not. But if you can, it would be a good thing." Then he was gone. She stepped down from the wagon. The kitchen of Rourke's Bend was a battlefield from the moment she walked into it. The stove was a black cast-iron beast that occupied an entire wall, and it had moods the way some horses have moods. The chopping table was scarred to the grain. The shelves held flour and beans and salt and lard, and not much else. Knives needed sharpening. The water bucket was empty. There was a quarter of beef hanging in the cold room and a string of dried onions and a sack of potatoes that wanted picking through. She had 4 hours before 15 men would walk through the door. She tied her apron. She started the fire. The fire died. She started it again. The fire roared up and ate 3 sticks of kindling in a minute. She adjusted the damper the wrong way. Smoke filled the room. She opened the back door. Cold air blew in. The fire died again. She sat on the floor for a moment with her face in her hands. Then she stood up. She tried again. By the time the dinner bell rang, she had a pot of stew which had been too thin until she thickened it with flour, and too salty until she stretched it with potatoes. She had a tray of biscuits, which were burned slightly on the bottom and pale on the top, because she did not yet understand that the right side of the oven ran hotter. She had coffee that could strip paint. The men came in one at a time. A young man with sand-colored hair and freckles no older than 22 gave her a careful nod. Tucker Hayes. An older man with 3 medals he never wore on a wall in the bunkhouse, and a tin cup hooked permanently to his belt. And the slight hesitation of an old leg wound sat down without speaking. Old Roy Madsen. The boys called him Tin Cup. A lean man with red dark hair and pale blue eyes and a quiet that seemed to follow him into the room. Wade McKenna. A round-faced Irishman who tipped his hat and said, "Ma'am, there is a different smell in this kitchen tonight, and I'm grateful for it." Jim Doyle. Whiskey, the others called him, though no one would tell her why. 12 more came in behind them. Their names she would learn slowly. They sat at the long table. They waited. Cal Rourke came in last. He took the chair at the head of the table without comment. He looked once at the stew, once at the biscuits, once at her. He did not speak. The men ate. There were a few low remarks she could not catch. The biscuits were broken in half and dipped in stew. The coffee was drunk and the cups were refilled. Tin Cup ate his portion and then a second portion. Tucker Hayes smiled at her once quickly, as though he wanted her to know it was all right. When the meal was over, Cal Rourke pushed back from the table and walked out onto the back porch. He turned his head once. She followed him. The Wyoming sky behind the house was the color of a slow-burning fire. The mountains stood black against it. The prairie ran out to the edge of the world. He did not look at her when he spoke. The stew was undersalted. The biscuits were heavy. The coffee was bad. She said nothing. But you did not run when the fire went out twice. And you asked Tucker how to lift the kettle off the stove instead of pretending you already knew. That tells me something. He turned his face toward her then. The iron in his eyes had not warmed, but it had moved somehow. You have 6 more days. He went down the porch steps and walked toward the barn, his slight limp marking him against the red sky. She stood on the porch until he had vanished. Then she went back into the kitchen, and she did the dishes by lantern light until her hands were raw. And she did not cry, because she had used up her tears in Philadelphia, and there were none left. That night, in the small room off the kitchen that was now hers, she sat on the edge of a narrow bed and opened her carpet bag. She took out Edmund's ledger. She held it in her lap. She turned the pages slowly. St. 200 bottles. Galveston. St. 100 bottles. El Paso. St. Special order. Wyoming. No questions. She closed the ledger. She did not know yet what those 2 letters meant. 40 miles east in the back room of the Iron Horse Saloon in Cedar Falls, a man in a long oilcloth coat sat at a corner table with a glass of whiskey in front of him. His hat shadowed his face. A long mark ran from his temple to his jaw, pale against his weathered skin. He had paid the barkeep a gold dollar to keep the table empty around him. He set down his glass. He lifted his eyes to the bartender. "I am looking for a man," he said. His voice was rough with 7 years of prison dust. Used to live in Texas, tall, walks with a limp, owns a piece of land around here, goes by Rourke. The bartender wiped a glass and did not answer right away. "Mister," he said slowly, "I do not know you." The man in the long coat smiled. It was not a kind smile. "You will," he said. He drank his whiskey down and set the glass on the table, and he laid 2 more gold dollars beside it. "Tell me where to find him." And outside, the lamps of Cedar Falls flickered in the cold prairie wind, and 40 miles to the northwest, in a kitchen lit only by a single tallow candle, a woman sat on a narrow bed and held a leather ledger in her hands, and a man with old wounds stood at the window of his dark house and watched the moon rise over the country he had built to forget. And neither of them knew yet that the same name was waiting in the dark for both of them. The first week at Rourke's Bend taught Margaret Ashford more about her own hands than the 43 years before it ever had. She learned that the cast iron stove had a temper, and that the temper could be read in the smoke. White smoke meant the fire was hungry. Black smoke meant she had fed it too much pine. Pale blue smoke, almost invisible against the morning sky outside the kitchen window, meant the stove was content and bread could go in. She learned that biscuits required a cold hand. Her own hands were warm, and her first 3 batches came out tough as saddle leather. On the 4th morning, she went to the well at dawn and plunged her hands into water so cold it took her breath away, and she held them there until they ached. And then she went back inside and made biscuits that rose. Tucker Hayes ate too and looked at her with surprise and said nothing which she understood to be the highest praise the country offered. She learned that coffee, real cowboy coffee, was not the polite brown beverage of Philadelphia. It was a black drink that men poured into tin cups and held in calloused hands and drank standing up at 3 in the morning with the smell of horses on their shirts and the cold of the prairie still in their bones. It needed to be strong enough to keep a man on his feet for 12 hours. She made it weaker the first day, and old Roy Madsen, called Tin Cup, took 1 sip and looked at her with the kindest disappointment she had ever seen. "Ma'am," he said, "I have been drinking this coffee for 38 years. I drank it at Gettysburg before the 2nd day's fighting. I drank it on a cattle drive from San Antonio to Abilene. I drank it the morning my wife was buried and the morning my son was buried after her. I am asking you with respect to please make it stronger." She made it stronger the next morning. He did not say anything when he tasted it. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, and she understood. By the end of the 1st week, she had not run. By the end of the 2nd, the men had stopped looking at her like a stranger and started looking at her like the keeper of the kitchen, which on a ranch is something close to a queen. They tracked less mud in. They took off their hats when they crossed the threshold. They washed their hands at the basin by the back door without being asked. Cal Rourke watched all of this without comment. He came to the kitchen at dawn each morning before the rest. He stood at the stove and poured his own coffee into a tin cup older than most of his men. He did not sit. He did not speak. He stood by the window and looked out at the corrals while she worked the dough, and then he would set the cup down and walk out into the cold. This was the closest thing she had to company in those first weeks. She came to listen for his step on the porch boards. He came to listen for the sound of her stove door opening before the rest of the world was awake. Neither of them said a word about it. The 3rd Monday she was at the ranch, Margaret burned a tray of biscuits. She had set them in and turned to roll out a pie crust, and somewhere between the apples and the cinnamon, she lost track of the time, and when she opened the oven door, the kitchen filled with the bitter smoke of charcoal. The coffee pot at the same moment chose to boil over and douse half the fire, and as she lunged to grab the pot, her elbow knocked the milk pail off the table, and a morning's worth of fresh milk went across the kitchen floor in a slow white tide. She stood in the middle of it, the smoke, the hissing stove, the white river of milk, the blackened biscuits. 12 minutes until the breakfast bell. "Damn this stove," she said very softly. "Damn it to hell." "Language, Mrs. Ashford." She turned. Cal Rourke stood in the doorway. He was already dressed for the day. His hat was in his hand. His face was unreadable. She felt the heat climb up her neck. "Mr. Rourke, I am sorry." I will have something on the table. I do not know what, but I will." He did not answer her right away. He stepped into the kitchen. He set his hat on a peg. He rolled up his sleeves to the elbow. And for the first time in her life, Margaret Ashford saw the forearms of a man who had spent 20 years working with his hands. The long, ropey muscle, the old scars, the place above the right wrist where something once had cut him deep. He went to the stove and adjusted the damper with 2 precise movements. He pulled the coffee pot off. He looked at the spilled milk and the burned biscuits and said quietly, "Pancakes, they are faster. They are easier. You mix. I will tend the stove." She stared at him. "You can cook." "I can survive, Pa," he said. "I lived in this house 3 years before I hired anyone. I lived alone. A man learns what he has to." She mixed the batter. He tended the fire. They moved around each other in the small kitchen without bumping, without speaking. Once reaching for the salt, his hand passed her shoulder and did not quite touch it, and she felt the heat of him for half a second, and then it was gone. When Tucker Hayes pushed open the back door with the morning eggs in a basket and saw his boss at the stove turning pancakes with a flat iron, he stopped in the doorway with his mouth half open. "Tucker," Cal said without looking up. "Eggs in the big skillet. Salt pork is sliced on the counter. Move." Tucker moved. The men ate pancakes and salt pork and fried eggs that morning, and if any of them noticed flour on the cuff of Cal Rourke's shirt, they were wise enough not to comment. After the meal, when the men had gone out into the cold and the kitchen was empty again, Cal stood at the door with his hat in his hand. He looked at her for a long moment. "My mother used to say a kitchen without a mistake in it was a kitchen with no one in it." His voice was very low. "Do not apologize for the biscuits, Mrs. Ashford. Apologize when you stop trying." He went out. She stood at the sink for a long time with the water running over her hands. That afternoon he came back into the kitchen, carrying something wrapped in faded cloth. He set it on the table without ceremony. "This was my mother's," he said. "It was in a trunk in the loft. I have not opened that trunk in 17 years. The book is yours to use. Be careful with it. The pages are soft." She unwrapped it. It was a cookbook. The cloth cover had once been blue. Years of use had darkened it almost to black. Texas Receipts for the Frontier Wife was stamped in faded gold on the spine. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with recipes in a neat woman's hand, with notes added in the margins. Salt rising bread, apple butter, smokehouse instructions for a quarter of beef, a page on how to tell good lard from bad, a page on cures for a cough using honey and a little whiskey. She turned a page. A note in fading ink leapt at her. "Calvin's favorite. Add extra cinnamon. He will not eat them if you do not." Margaret's throat closed. She lifted her eyes. Cal was standing at the window, his back to her, his shoulders set in a way she had begun to recognize as the way he stood when he did not want his face read. "Mr. Rourke," she said quietly, "your mother loved you very much." He did not turn around. She did. She was a good woman. She came to Texas from Louisiana when she married my father. She thought she was coming to a great adventure. What she got was a ranch on the edge of nothing with Comanche raids twice a year. and a husband who never said anything kind out loud. He paused. She kept this book on a shelf above the stove. She used it every day. She wrote in it for 40 years. The last entry she made was 3 weeks before they killed her. I was in St. Louis. I was studying law. I came home to ashes and 3 fresh graves. My father, my mother, my sister Esme, who was 12 years old. His voice did not rise. It did not break. It simply went very flat and very far away, like something speaking from the bottom of a well. I did not go back to St. Louis. I joined the Texas Rangers 2 months later. I learned that there are some debts the law is too slow to collect. I learned that justice and law are not always the same animal. I spent 8 years collecting that debt. And when I was done, I had nothing left in me to be a lawyer with. Margaret closed the cookbook gently. Her fingers stayed on the cover. "You went to school to be a lawyer," she said. "I was supposed to be a lawyer. I became something else." She did not ask what. She understood that he was telling her something he had told to almost no one, and that any question now would close the door. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I will use this book. I will be careful with it. Thank you." He turned then, and for the first time since she had come to Rourke's Bend, she saw something other than iron in his face. It was not warmth exactly. It was the place where warmth might live if a man let himself live there again. "Use it," he said. "It is meant to be used. Pages that are not turned are pages that are forgotten." He picked up his hat and went out. She sat at the table for a long time with her hand on the soft cloth cover of his mother's book, and she understood that she had been entrusted with something that no city woman in a parlor on Walnut Street could have understood, and that nothing in her former life had prepared her to deserve. A week later, the kitchen became a hospital. Margaret was kneading bread when she heard the shouting in the yard. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out the back door. 4 men were carrying Tucker Hayes between them. His right arm was hanging at the wrong angle, and his face was the color of old paper. "His horse spooked at a rattler," one of the men said. "Threw him on his shoulder. We think it is broke clean, ma'am." She did not hesitate. "Bring him in. Lay him on the long table. Move the lantern closer. Wade, I need straight strips of pine 2 feet long, 4 of them. Whiskey, the bottle from the cupboard. Not the one in the cabinet. I need clean cloths torn into strips 3 fingers wide. Someone hold his head still and someone hold his good shoulder. Do not let him jerk." The men obeyed her without comment, which surprised them all later. Cal Rourke appeared in the doorway. He took one look. He came inside. He did not ask. He went to the head of the table and placed his hands on Tucker's shoulders to brace him. Margaret felt along the bone. The break was clean. No splinter. No piercing. She had seen this kind of injury a dozen times in Edmund's office. She looked at Tucker. "This is going to hurt for 1 second, and then it is going to feel better than you can imagine. Do you trust me?" Tucker was 22 years old, and his face was pale, and his eyes were very wide, and he said, "Yes, ma'am, I trust you." She set the bone. He yelled once, and then he went very quiet, breathing hard, and she could see in his face the moment the deep pain eased, the moment the bone settled back where it belonged. She splinted the arm with the pine strips and bound it with the cloth, and tied the sling tight enough to hold but loose enough not to cut off the blood. She washed her hands. 6 weeks, she said to him. No work with that arm, none. Light walking, eat well. If a fever comes up, you tell me at once. If the fingers go cold or blue, you tell me at once. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. The men carried him to the bunkhouse to rest. Cal stayed. He stood at the table while she rinsed her hands in the basin and watched her with an intensity that she could feel along the back of her neck. Mrs. Ashford, he said quietly, where did a Philadelphia widow learn to set a bone like that? She dried her hands on a clean cloth. She looked at him. She had not meant to say it, but there was something in his face that did not let her lie. When you are married to a surgeon, she said, who drinks too much laudanum to hold a knife steady, you learn to finish the work. I did not assist Edmund Mr. Rourke. There were many nights when I performed the work and he watched from a chair. I have set bones. I have stitched wounds. I have delivered children when the midwife could not be found. I have removed an appendix from a stable boy on my own dining room table when Edmund was insensible upstairs. I am not what I appear to be. I never have been. I am sorry if that is an unwelcome surprise. Cal did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, Mrs. Ashford, the day I met you, I thought I had hired a cook. I see now I hired something else. I am not surprised. I am grateful. He picked up his hat. You saved that boy's arm. Tucker lost his father in the war when he was 4 years old. I have known him since he was 16. He is the closest thing to a son I have. You did not just set a bone today. Whatever you need, you ask me, and you will have it. He walked out. She sat down at the table because her knees had gone weak and her hands had begun to shake, which was the only place in the world it was safe for them to shake in the empty kitchen after the work was done. The storm came 2 weeks before the dance. It came the way Wyoming storms always come, which is to say, without warning and without mercy. Wade McKenna walked into the kitchen at 4 in the afternoon with his hat in his hand and dust on his shoulders and said, Cal, there is a wall coming down from the northwest. Black ice. We need every hand on the upper pasture, or we lose half the herd by morning. Cal looked once at the sky out the window. The sky had gone the color of wet slate. Saddle up, all of you. Within the hour, 15 men rode out into the gathering wind. The temperature dropped 20 degrees before the last of them was out of sight. By dark, the sleet was coming sideways, and the sound on the kitchen windows was no longer rain but small, hard stones of ice. Margaret stood at the window with her arms crossed against the cold and watched it come. Old Pete Sawyer, too old now to ride a long night in weather, came in with an armful of wood and set it by the stove. The youngest cowboy at 16, a boy named Charlie, stayed back with a sprained ankle. They will come back, Pete said. They have come back through worse. Margaret did not answer. She built up the fire. She put on a great iron pot of stew. She set bread to rise. She filled every kettle. She tore old shirts into bandages and stacked them on the table. She did not let herself think about what she was preparing for. The first 3 men came back at midnight, half frozen, leading a horse with a broken leg between them. Margaret stripped them out of their wet coats by the stove and put hot coffee into their hands before they could speak. "Where is Cal?" "Still out," Tucker Hayes said through chattering teeth. "He sent us in. Said the herd was bunched in the south draw. Said he would not leave Wade and Whiskey out there alone. 4 more came in at 2 in the morning. Then 4 more. By 3:11 of the 15 were back. Cal was not among them. Wade was not among them. Whiskey was not among them. Margaret kept the fire fed. She kept the coffee on. She needed a 4th batch of bread because she had to keep her hands moving or she would scream. Tin cup. Madsen came and stood beside her at the kitchen table at 4 in the morning. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he took his tin cup from his belt and set it on the wood. "Ma'am, Cal Rourke has come through bullets that should have buried him and 10 years of grief in a country that tried twice to kill him. He will come through this." Margaret did not look up from the dough. "Mr. Madsen, if I look at the window one more time, I will break. Please, talk to me about something, anything." So Tin Cup sat down at the table and told her about Pennsylvania, where he had been a boy, about a girl he had loved before the war, about the morning at Gettysburg, when he had been 22 and had carried a wounded sergeant a 1/4 mile through artillery fire, because there had been no one else to do it. He talked for an hour. She kept her hands in the dough. She did not weep. She did not stop listening. At 10 minutes after 5, when the wind had begun to ease and the first gray hint of dawn was showing in the eastern sky, a single bell on Wade's tripwire system rang out by the corral. Then a voice in the yard. "Open the door." Margaret reached the back door before her feet remembered to move. 3 men stood on the porch. Wade McKenna. Jim Whiskey Doyle bleeding from a long cut along his jaw, where ice had cut him from a fallen branch. And Cal Rourke, the slight unevenness of his step worse than usual, now his coat sheeted with ice. His eyes the only living thing in his face. Margaret pulled them inside. She did not say anything. She could not. Her hands went through the work without asking permission. Coat off, boots off, hot water, towels. She washed Whiskey's cut and pressed cloth to it. She put a tin cup of black coffee into Wade's hands. She came last to Cal. He was standing by the stove. He had not moved since she had brought him in. He was watching her. She walked up to him. She did not stop until her forehead rested against the cold, ice-stiff wool of his coat over his heart. He put his arm around her. He did not say anything either. After a moment, she felt his hand come up and rest against the back of her head very gently, the way a man touches something he has thought he had lost and only just found again. "I thought you were dead," she said into his coat. "Maggie, do not say it. Do not say a single word that sounds like a goodbye. Cal Rourke, not now. Not after this night. I will not hear it. I was not going to." "Then what?" "I was going to say I am here." She closed her eyes. The men in the kitchen had the good grace to look at the floor and the walls and their coffee cups, and not at the woman who had her face pressed to their boss's coat. The herd was safe. They had lost 11 head. They had been ready to lose 300. 3 days later, when Cal walked back into the kitchen from the corrals with the limp, slightly worse than it had been before the storm, but his face clearer than she had seen it since she had come to Wyoming, he set his hat on the peg and he said, "Maggie." Yes, there is a dance in Cedar Falls at the end of the month. The men have been pestering me about it. She turned from the stove. And I think we should go. Then the mail came up from Cedar Falls. Old Pete Sawyer drove the supply wagon in at noon with a load of flour and salt and dry goods and a thin packet of letters tied with twine. He handed the bundle to Cal on the porch and went off to water the team. Cal stood in the yard and sorted through the letters. There was one to the bunkhouse. There was a notice about cattle prices. And there was one small envelope addressed in a hand he knew at once, a sharp, careful hand that had not changed in 12 years. The return marked it from Cheyenne, from Jed Bishop, United States Marshal. He went into his office and closed the door. He did not come out for an hour. When he did, his face had gone to stone. Margaret saw it from the kitchen window and her stomach turned over without her knowing why. That evening at supper, he ate almost nothing. He drank 1 cup of coffee. He spoke to the men only enough to give the next day's orders. When the meal was over and the men had gone, he sat alone at the long table with his back to the kitchen and stared at the wall. Margaret cleared the dishes around him in silence. At last she said, "Mr. Rourke, may I ask if something is wrong?" He looked up. For a long moment he seemed to weigh whether to speak. Then he said, "Sit down, Mrs. Ashford." She sat across from him. 7 years ago, he said, I shot a man on the Mexican border. I shot him 3 times. He shot me 3 times. He should have died. He did not. He went to Huntsville prison. He was sentenced to 10 years. He looked at her steadily. Jed Bishop is an old friend of mine. We rode together as rangers. He writes to tell me that the man I shot has been released. He served 7 years. He is no longer in Texas. He has been seen on the road between Denver and Cheyenne. Jed believes he is coming north. Margaret did not move. "Coming for you," she said. "Yes." She felt the floor go a little distant beneath her chair. His name, Cal did not look away from her. Silas Thorne. The room turned very cold and very quiet. Margaret's hand moved by itself to the locket at her collar, where she had pinned a small lock of Edmund's hair. And she felt the world tilt a few degrees. And she knew without yet understanding why the way one knows an animal is in the room before one sees it. S.T. She did not say the letters aloud. Not yet. "Mr. Rourke," she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded. He stood up. He took his hat from the peg. He stopped at the door. "Mrs. Ashford, I do not know what he intends. I do not know when he will arrive, but I want you to know that if it becomes dangerous to stay, I will pay for your passage anywhere you choose to go. You do not have to be here for this." She looked at him across the room. "Mr. Rourke, I have run as far as I am going to run in this life. Whatever is coming, I will be here when it comes." He looked at her for a long moment. He did not argue. He nodded once and went out into the dark. She stood at the kitchen sink for a long time after that. The autumn dance at Cedar Falls came at the end of October. Cal did not normally go. He had not gone in 3 years. But the men had been working hard, and the cattle had come in fat, and the harvest had been good. and he announced at supper one Sunday that the wagon would leave for Cedar Falls at noon on Saturday, and the men whooped like boys. He said to Margaret in the kitchen afterward, "You will need supplies, cloth, sugar, spices that the boys have been asking after. Come along. You will sleep at Holloway's. I will pay for the room. The men have been pestering me about a dance. There will be one." She said, "Mr. Rourke, I do not have a proper dress." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I will leave something on the chair by your door tonight. It belonged to my mother. You may not want it if you do not throw it out. If you do, it is yours." That night, when she returned from washing the dishes, there was a brown paper parcel on the chair outside her door. She unwrapped it in the lamplight. It was a dress of deep blue wool, plain and well made with simple ivory buttons up the front. A church dress. A dance dress. A dress for a rancher's wife, not for a Philadelphia matron. The fabric was good and the seams were strong, and the hem had been carefully turned by hand. She held it against herself in the mirror. The blue brought the green out of her eyes. The cut would need to be taken in at the waist. The hem would need to come up an inch. By Saturday, it could be ready. She sat down on the bed with the dress across her lap. For a long time, she did not move. Then she began to sew. Saturday came clear and cold. The wagon rolled into Cedar Falls in the late afternoon with the men washed and shaved and self-conscious in their cleanest shirts. Margaret, in her blue dress and her hair pinned up, sat beside Cal on the high seat. He had put on a dark coat she had never seen before and a clean white shirt. And he looked, she realized, with a small private shock, like a gentleman. She did her shopping at Briggs's store. Amos Briggs eyed her dress with surprise and then approval. Mrs. Carleton stood in the doorway of the dressmaker's and spoke loudly to a friend about how the Philadelphia widow had certainly settled in, had not she, and looked very fine considering. Widow Holloway, when Margaret stopped by the boarding house, took her hand and said quietly, "It is about time that man went out among people again. You go on and have a dance, Mrs. Ashford." The dance hall was the upstairs room above the feed store. The musicians were 3 local men with a fiddle, a banjo, and a harmonica. The floor was sawdust. The lanterns were hung from the rafters and threw a warm gold light over everything. Cal stood near the back wall with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the room. He did not dance at first. He watched. Margaret danced with Tucker Hayes, whose splinted arm kept him from doing more than a slow turn, and with Jim Whiskey Doyle, who told her 3 jokes in a row about Irishmen and saints. She danced with Tin Cup Madsen, who held her at a respectful arm's length and apologized in advance for stepping on her toes, which he did exactly twice. She danced with Wade McKenna, who said almost nothing but who moved with a quiet grace that surprised her, and who at the end of the dance gave her a small nod that was the deepest courtesy she had received in months. When the musicians struck up a slow waltz, the room changed. The younger couples paired off. The older men retreated to the punch table. Cal Rourke crossed the floor. He stopped in front of her. He held out his hand. He did not say a word. She put her hand in his. He led her into the dance. He moved like a man who had been taught to dance in a fine room many years before by a mother who had cared about such things. His hand at the small of her back was steady. His other hand held hers lightly. He guided her through the turn at the end of the floor, without a single misstep. She felt the slight unevenness of his bad leg as a small hitch in the rhythm, and she adjusted to it without thinking. And after the first few measures, she stopped feeling it at all. "You dance well for a cattleman," she said quietly. "You dance well for a cook." The corners of his mouth moved. It was not a smile. It was the place where a smile would be if a man let it. They turned. The lanterns swung overhead. The fiddle climbed. For one full minute, Margaret Ashford forgot the ledger in her trunk, and Edmund's locked confessional drawer, and the letter from Cheyenne and the man in the long oilcloth coat she had seen at the edge of the lamplight that first night. For one full minute, she was a woman in a blue dress, dancing with a man in a dark coat, in a warm room above a feed store in Wyoming. And then she saw him. He was standing against the far wall near the door. He was alone. He was not dancing. He had a glass of whiskey in his left hand, and his right hand was hooked into his belt. He wore the long oilcloth coat that he had not bothered to take off. His hat was low on his face, but the lantern light caught him at exactly the wrong angle, and she saw the long pale line that ran from his temple to the corner of his jaw. He was looking at her. He raised his glass an inch in her direction. He smiled. Margaret missed a step. Cal felt it at once. He looked down at her. "Do not turn your head," he said quietly. "Tell me." "There is a man," she said. "Long coat, scar. He is by the door. He is watching me." Cal did not turn. He continued the waltz. He guided her very smoothly away from the door and toward the musicians, putting the crowd between her and the stranger. "Describe him." "Tall, gray at the temples, marked from his temple to his jaw. He has not taken off his coat." The hand at her back went still for half a second. Then it resumed its place just as gently as before. But she felt the change in him the way the air changes before a storm. "Mrs. Ashford, when this dance ends, you will walk with me to the door. You will not turn your head toward him. You will not stop walking. We will go down the stairs and out into the street. Do you understand?" Yes. The waltz ended. The musicians began to call out the next tune. Cal kept her hand. He did not let her stop. He guided her to the edge of the room. He nodded once to Tin Cup, who had been watching from the punch bowl. Tin Cup set his cup down and followed at a distance of about 10 paces. They reached the door. The man in the long coat was no longer there. The space where he had stood was empty. The glass he had been holding sat on a windowsill. The lantern light fell on nothing. Cal looked at the window. He looked at the door. He took her hand more firmly. They went down the stairs. The street outside was dark and cold and full of the smell of horses. The wagons were lined up along the rail. The Iron Horse saloon at the end of the block was lit and noisy. The wind moved a tin sign somewhere. Cal walked her quickly to the boarding house. Tin Cup walked behind them with his hand resting on his belt where his pistol was. At the door of Holloway's, Cal stopped. "You will stay inside tonight," he said quietly. "You will lock the door. You will not open it for anyone but me or Tin Cup or Tucker. Do you understand?" "Yes." He hesitated. Then he said, "Mrs. Ashford, I am sorry." "For what?" "For bringing this to your door." I thought I had more time. She looked up at him. Mr. Rourke. He was looking for me before he ever knew I was at your ranch. He did not understand her yet. She watched him, not understanding. She reached up before she could stop herself, and she laid her hand against the rough wool of his coat over his heart, where one of the bullets had gone in 7 years before. Cal, she said. The name came out without permission. There is something I must tell you, but not tonight. Tomorrow, when we are home. His hand came up and covered hers against his chest. Tomorrow, he said. She went inside. She locked the door. She went up to her room. She did not sleep. In the room she had taken at the back of the boarding house, she sat on the edge of the bed, with Edmund's ledger open across her knees, and she read the entries in the lamplight, one by one. St. 100 bottles. 200 bottles. Special order. Wyoming. No questions. St. Silas Thorne. The man at the dance had said her husband's name. Edmund had been his supplier. Edmund had died of an overdose alone at his desk on a Tuesday morning with no note in his own hand. Edmund had been afraid in his last months, jumping at footsteps, locking and relocking the door. Edmund had not killed himself. She closed the ledger very slowly. She set it on the small table beside the bed. She looked at the door. She listened to the silence of the boarding house. Outside, somewhere down the street, a man laughed in the saloon and another man cursed at a horse, and the wind moved against the window glass. And 40 miles to the northwest, at Rourke's Bend Ranch, the lamp in the main house burned all night long. Cal Rourke did not sleep either. He sat at the long kitchen table in his dark house, with his pistol on the wood in front of him, and a single tallow candle burning low. And he stared at the door and waited for morning, because something had finally come back for him, after 7 years. And he meant to meet it on his own ground when it came. In the morning, he would learn that the woman who had set Tucker's arm and made his men laugh again was carrying the very ledger that could send the man on a rope to the gallows. In the morning, he would understand that her husband had not died by his own hand. In the morning, the two graves that had been calling to each other across 2,000 miles would finally know whose names they had been calling. But that was the morning. Tonight, the candle burned and the wind moved the dry grass outside. And somewhere in the dark country between Cedar Falls and Rourke's Bend, a man with an old wound on his face was sitting his horse in the cold and looking at the lights of a distant ranch through a pair of brass field glasses. And he was counting them one by one the way a man counts the days he has waited in a cell to come and do what he had come to do. She came home to Rourke's Bend the next afternoon in the back of the supply wagon, with Edmund's ledger wrapped in oilcloth and pressed against her ribs beneath her shawl. Cal rode beside the wagon on a tall bay gelding. He did not speak the whole way. His eyes were on the country. Every ridge, every stand of cottonwood, every dry creek bed where a man might wait with a rifle. The slight unevenness of his bad leg meant nothing in the saddle. He sat the horse the way a man sits a chair he has owned for 20 years. Tin Cup Madsen rode behind the wagon, and Wade McKenna rode ahead. And Tucker Hayes, who had refused to be left behind despite his splinted arm, drove the team with his good hand, and a length of rein looped around his bandaged wrist. None of them spoke either. The wind moved the brown grass. The sky was a hard, pale blue. When the buildings of the ranch came into view in the long bowl of land below them, Margaret felt something move in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief. It was the feeling of coming home to a place that had not yet finished, becoming a home but had stopped being a place she was only passing through. She climbed down from the wagon at the porch. Cal stepped down from his horse. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Inside," he said. She followed him through the front door of the main house. He had never invited her past the kitchen door of the main residence in 2 months at Rourke's Bend. Now he led her down a short hall to a room she had never seen his office, with a heavy oak desk and shelves of agricultural journals and a few books of poetry, and a small framed daguerreotype on the wall of a young woman in a high collar with a little girl on her lap. He closed the door. "Now," he said, "tell me." She unwound the oilcloth and set the ledger on his desk. "My husband," she said, "was a doctor. He became addicted to laudanum in the last 6 years of his life. After he died, I was told he had taken his own life. I believed that. I believed it because I had been telling myself for years that he was capable of it, and because the alternative was unthinkable. But after the creditors took the house, when I was packing what little they let me keep, I found this hidden behind a panel in his desk drawer." She opened the ledger. He kept these records for almost 2 years before he died. "The patients here have no names, only initials. The amounts are not medical. They are commercial. He was supplying someone with large quantities of pharmaceutical-grade laudanum, hundreds of bottles at a time, shipments to El Paso, to Galveston, to here in Wyoming. The buyer is always referred to by 2 letters, ST. Cal lifted the ledger. He turned to the back pages. He read for a long time. His face did not change, but his hand on the page went very still. Maggie. It was the first time he had used her name out loud. "Yes. Your husband did not kill himself. I know. Silas Thorne killed him, to close his mouth. Edmund must have grown frightened enough to think about going to the authorities. This ledger is the record of every shipment. It is the rope that would have hanged the man in any court in this country." She nodded. She had known since the long candlelit hours in Cedar Falls. "Cal," she said, "he came to the dance because he was looking for me before he was looking for you. He was tracking the ledger. He must have learned somehow that Edmund's widow had gone west. He has been watching for me. He spoke my husband's name to me at the dance. He whispered it. He asked what Edmund had left me." Cal closed the ledger. He set it down very gently, the way a man sets down a thing that could go off. "Then this is no longer about a Texas grudge between him and me. This is about that book. He cannot let you live, and he cannot let me live, because between us we have the rope and the reason. He will come for both of us together. Yes." He looked at her across the desk. "Maggie, I gave you my word last night. If you want to go, I will see you safely to any city in the country. Chicago, St. Louis, Boston, anywhere. With money enough to start again under a different name. Cal Rourke. Yes. I am not running from this man. He killed my husband. He is coming for the men I cook for. He is coming for you. I will not run." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes moved. "Then we will meet him here," he said. They told the men that night. Cal gathered the whole crew in the kitchen. 15 men in dust-colored shirts, hats in their hands, standing along the walls. Tucker Hayes with his splinted arm. Tin Cup Madsen with his slow, careful breath. Wade McKenna leaning against the door frame in his quiet way. Whiskey Doyle and 12 others. Cal stood at the head of the table where he ate every night, and he told them about Texas, about the Rangers, about the silver star he had laid down in the caliche 7 years before, about Silas Thorne, about the wounds he carried, about the prison in Huntsville, and the man who had come out of it counting the days until he could come north. He told them about Edmund Ashford, the Philadelphia surgeon, and the ledger that proved a network of stolen pharmaceutical laudanum and the dozen other doctors across the country who had been forced or paid into supplying it. He told them that Margaret Ashford was Edmund's widow, and that the man coming for him was coming for her too. "I will not pretend to you," he said, "that this is your fight. It is not. You signed on to a cattle ranch. You signed on to ride for a brand. You did not sign on to defend a man's old debts. Any man who wants to ride out tonight will be paid through the end of the year and given a horse and my thanks. There will be no shame in it. There will be no story told later that anyone ran. I will say myself that you were sent." He paused. "But I am not leaving, and I have asked Marshal Jed Bishop in Cheyenne to come up. He has not yet answered. He may not get here in time. So I am telling you what I know." The kitchen was very quiet. Tin Cup Madsen took his tin cup off his belt. He set it down on the table. He cleared his throat. "Cal," he said, "I fought at Gettysburg. I was 22 years old. I saw things in 3 days there that I have not been able to wash out of my head in 40 years. I have ridden for you for 9 seasons. You took me on when no other outfit would have an old man with a bad leg and bullets buried in him. You paid me a fair wage and you fed me, and you did not ask me to be young again. If a man is riding up here to take that from me, then he will have to ride over me first. I am not leaving." He sat down. Tucker Hayes stood up. His voice was younger and rougher. "My father died in the war when I was 4. I do not remember his face. I remember my mother washing other women's laundry until her hands cracked open. I came to this ranch when I was 16. Cal Rourke is the man who taught me to rope and to read a brand and to keep my word. I am standing with him." He sat down. Wade McKenna spoke from the doorway. He did not move from it. "I rode with you in Texas, Cal. I have not forgotten. I am here." Whiskey Doyle grinned a tired Irish grin and said, "Boss, I have never in my life turned away from a fight that had whiskey women and a fair chance of getting shot. This one has all 3. I am in." One by one, the rest of them spoke. Some said only a few words. Some said only their names. Hollis Pike, 29 years old, with a young wife waiting for him in Cheyenne, said simply, "I am staying," and looked at the floor and did not say more. Not one man rode out. When it was over, Cal stood at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood, and Margaret watched his face, and she saw what he had not been able to say. "Then we have work to do," he said. For 3 days, they made the ranch into a fort. They piled sandbags at the windows. They cut firing slits in the heavy shutters. They dug a shallow trench between the bunkhouse and the main house so a man could move under cover. Wade McKenna went out on foot at dawn and at dusk and set wire trip lines through the brush at the approaches and looped tin cans on them so that no horse could come close in the dark without ringing the alarm. He cached water and ammunition in 3 positions outside the main buildings. He marked the line of fire from each window with a small stone in the dust. He did not say much while he did this. He did not need to. The men did what he told them. Cal sent old Pete Sawyer riding south at midnight with a sealed letter for Marshal Jed Bishop in Cheyenne. Pete was 62 years old, and his hands had begun to shake, but he could still ride and he knew the country. And he left without complaint. They watched him go off into the dark with a fresh horse and a pack horse behind, and they did not know whether they would see him again. On the second afternoon, Cal called Margaret out behind the smokehouse. He had a Winchester 73 in his hands. "Maggie," he said, "I'm going to teach you to shoot this rifle, not because I think you will need it, because if you need it, I want you to be able to use it." He showed her how to set her feet, the left one forward, the right one back. He showed her how to bring the stock up against her shoulder and seat it firmly against the muscles so that the recoil would not bruise her collarbone. He showed her how to align the brass bead at the end of the barrel with the rear notch. He showed her how to breathe out half a breath and hold it, and then to squeeze the trigger, not pull it. He stood close behind her. His hand came up and adjusted her elbow. His other hand rested for a moment on her shoulder. "Squeeze," he said. "Do not pull. Pulling jerks the barrel. Squeezing lets the rifle do its work." She squeezed. The Winchester barked. The can on the fence post 50 feet away jumped into the air and fell. She lowered the rifle. He let his hand stay on her shoulder a second longer than he needed to. "Cal," she said. She did not turn around. "There is something I have to say to you." "Not now, Maggie." "Yes, now." "No." His voice was very quiet. "Not now. If you say it now, it will sound like a goodbye. I do not want a goodbye. Whatever you have to say to me, you say it after, not before." She nodded. She raised the rifle again. She hit the second can, the third can, the fourth. On the morning of the 4th day, Tucker Hayes came into the kitchen with his hat in his hand and his face troubled. "Mrs. Ashford." "Yes, Tucker." "I have seen something 3 days running. I should have said sooner. I did not because I did not understand." She set down the wooden spoon. "What have you seen?" "There is a little girl. She is sitting just beyond the south fence line in the dry creek bed. She is 7, maybe 8. She is alone. She does not move. I rode past her yesterday and gave her a piece of bread and a tin of water. She took them. She did not speak. She looked at me as if she had been told not to. I rode past her this morning and she was still there. She has been there for 3 days, ma'am. A child cannot live 3 days in that country without help." Margaret felt the cold come down her spine. "Take me to her." She put on her shawl. She picked up a tin of milk and a piece of yesterday's bread. She got Cal from the corral. The three of them walked together along the south fence line in the cold autumn sun. The child was in the dry creek bed where Tucker had said. She was sitting with her knees drawn up to her chest and her thin arms wrapped around them. Her dress was once blue and was now the color of dust. Her hair was the color of old straw. Her eyes were very large and very dark, and she did not flinch when they came near. Margaret knelt down at the edge of the creek bed. "What is your name, child?" The girl did not answer for a long moment. Then she said in a voice that had not been used in days, "Sarah Jane." "Sarah Jane, who brought you here?" "My father." "And where is your father now?" The girl's eyes did not move. "He said I had to stay here. He said if I moved, he would know and he would come back. He said I had to watch the house. He said when the shooting started, I had to remember whose side I was on." Margaret felt Cal go very still beside her. "Sarah Jane," Margaret said gently, "what is your father's name?" The child looked up at her. "Silas Thorne." Cal closed his eyes for one long second. He knelt down beside Margaret. His voice, when it came, was the gentlest she had ever heard from him. "Sarah Jane, do you know who I am? You are the man my father is gonna kill. Yes, I am that man. But I am also a man who has a warm house and food and a woman in the kitchen who makes the best biscuits in Wyoming. And no one will ever hit you in that house. No one will ever put you out in the cold. I give you my word." The girl looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up on legs that had gone weak from sitting, and she put her small, dirty hand into Cal's large, rough one. Without a word, he carried her back to the ranch on his hip the whole half-mile, as if she weighed nothing. That evening, when the child was bathed and fed and asleep in the small bed beside Margaret's, Cal stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark country. Maggie. Yes. She was put there as bait, or as a witness, or as a weight to make me hesitate. He is using his own daughter against me, against himself, against everything a man should not use a child for. He pressed his hand against the window frame. Her mother was a woman named Clara Thorne. She tried to leave him when she found out what he was. I came to her house the day after I shot him in Texas. She had taken her own life that morning. The neighbor said she had not been able to face the trial. I have carried her in me for 7 years. I did not know she had a child. I did not know. Margaret stood beside him at the window. She did not say anything. She put her hand on his arm. They stood there together for a long time. In the late afternoon of the next day, the kitchen became a hospital again. This time it was not Tucker. This time it was a boy of 16 named Danny Briggs, the nephew of Amos Briggs from the general store, who had come up to Rourke's Bend 3 weeks before to learn ranch work for a season. The boy was lean and red-haired and serious. He had taken to following Tucker Hayes like a shadow. He was working the south pen sorting yearling steers when one of the bulls broke from the line and gored him through the side. Tucker and Wade carried him in across a saddle. Blood had soaked his shirt from his ribs to his belt. "Lay him on the table," Margaret said. Her voice was already moving ahead of her thinking. "Cut his shirt away. Whiskey the good bottle from the cupboard. Wade boil water. All the water in the pot. I need the silk thread from my sewing box and the curved needle. Now." She bent over the boy. The wound was deep and ragged. The horn had gone in below the lowest rib and come out again. She pressed her hands along his belly and felt for the things she did not want to feel and did not find them. The bowel was not torn. The horn had passed through muscle and skin but had not gone deep enough to open the gut. The boy was conscious. He was very pale and his teeth were chattering with shock. "Danny, look at me." His eyes found her face. "You are going to live, Danny Briggs. Do you hear me? You will hurt for a long time, but you are going to live. I need you to hold still. Mr. Rourke is going to hold your shoulders. Tucker is going to hold your legs. I am going to clean this and close it. You may scream. You may say anything you like. But you may not move." "Yes, ma'am." Cal was already at the head of the table. He set his hands on the boy's shoulders. He bent down and spoke in the boy's ear, in a low, even voice she could not quite hear. But she recognized the rhythm. He was reciting something. A poem, perhaps, or a prayer. Whatever it was, the boy's breathing steadied. She cleaned the wound with whiskey. She packed it with cloth boiled in honey water. The old country remedy her grandmother had sworn against, rot in a wound. She closed the muscle layer with the silk thread small, careful stitches. She closed the skin with smaller stitches. She bandaged it tight. The work took an hour and 10 minutes by the clock on the wall. When she straightened up at last, her back was screaming and her hands were sticky to the wrist, and her apron was soaked through. Danny Briggs was still conscious. He looked up at her with eyes too large for his face. "Ma'am." "What? Did I yell?" "You did not yell once, Danny." "Tell Tucker." "I will tell him." She walked out onto the back porch and she sat down on the top step, and she put her face in her hands, and she shook for a full minute before she could stand up again. Cal followed her out. He sat down beside her on the step. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply sat the way a man sits beside something that has cost more than it can yet say. And he waited. After a long while, she lifted her face. "He will live, Cal. I know he will. He had you." She looked at him then in the last red light of the afternoon, at the lines around his iron eyes that had begun in the last weeks to crease a little when he looked at her. "Cal Rourke, if we live through what is coming, I want you to know that I did not come to Wyoming looking for a husband. I came looking for a place where I could be useful before I died. I have found the place. I do not need anything more than that." He was quiet for a moment. "Maggie, if we live through what is coming, I'm going to ask you for more than that." She did not answer him. She did not have to. They sat on the back step of Rourke's Bend in the gold light, and the cold wind and a 16-year-old boy slept his first healing sleep in the kitchen. Behind them, and somewhere out in the dark country, a man with an old wound was finishing his preparations. That night, very late after the lamps had been turned out, they sat together on the back porch with a single blanket between them against the cold. Cal told her about Rebecca. He told her about Lily. He told her about the day in Galveston, when he had come home wounded and found 2 graves in a neighbor, weeping in the doorway. He told her that he had buried them in one grave because no one in the cholera quarter had been left to dig 2. He told her that for 3 years after that, in this very house, he had not eaten a hot meal, except what he made himself, and had not slept more than 4 hours in any night. She told him about Edmund, about the early years when she had loved him, about the slow loss of the man she had married into the brown bottle, about the babies she had carried that had never been born, about the 100 dinners she had given as the wife of a respected Philadelphia surgeon, while upstairs her husband slept with a needle on the bedside table. They did not weep. They were too far past weeping. They simply spoke in the dark. Two people who had finally found another person who could hear the worst of it without flinching. When the wind shifted at 3 in the morning and the cold turned sharper, he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and she felt the slow, steady beat of his heart through the wool of his coat. "After this," she said, "if we are still here, I want to stay. Maggie, yes. I want you to stay even if we are not still here. I want you to know that. Whatever happens tomorrow or the day after, I want you to know that you came into this house and you found the laughter in it that had been gone since I buried Rebecca. I do not have words for what that is. I am not a man with words, but I want you to know it." She closed her eyes. "I know it, Cal." They sat there until the sky began to gray in the east. They came at first light the next morning. Wade McKenna was on the south ridge with a brass spyglass when he saw them. He did not call out. He did not whistle. He came down the slope on foot in long, quiet strides and slipped through the trench to the porch and tapped on the kitchen window with the back of his knuckle. Cal opened the back door. 20, Wade said. Mounted. Coming up the east approach. He is leading them. I saw the coat. I saw the face. Cal nodded once. To your positions. No one fires until I do. The men moved. They had drilled this for 3 days, and they moved like a thing that had been practiced. Tin Cup to the upstairs window of the main house with the long Sharps rifle that had been his at Gettysburg. Wade to the roof of the barn with his Winchester and his glass. Whiskey Doyle to the bunkhouse window. Tucker splinted arm and all to the kitchen door with a Colt pistol in his good hand. Hollis Pike to the corner of the smokehouse. Margaret took Sarah Jane to the cellar. She set the child on a folded blanket in the corner behind the potato barrels. She knelt in front of her. Sarah Jane, you will stay here. You will not come out for any reason. Not for a noise. Not for a voice. Not for someone calling your name. You will only come out when I or Mr. Rourke come for you. Do you understand? Yes. Margaret kissed her on the forehead. She left the lantern. She closed the cellar door. She picked up her Winchester 73. She loaded it. She walked through the kitchen and out the back door and took her position behind the woodpile at the corner of the porch where Cal had told her to stand. The riders crested the low ridge. 20 men. Hard men. Men with cartridge belts and dark coats and faces shadowed by hats pulled low. At the head of them rode Silas Thorne in his long oilcloth coat, the old wound on his face white in the early sun. He stopped his horse 50 yards from the main house. His men spread into a half circle behind him. He called out, and his voice was rough but loud and carried in the cold air. Cal Rourke, come out. Bring the woman with the book. Send your men away from this house. No man here needs to die today except the two of us. Cal stepped out onto the porch. He did not have a rifle in his hands. He had his hat on his head and a pistol on his hip and nothing else. Silas, he said, send your men back. Ride down here alone. We will finish what we started in Texas. No one else has to die. Silas Thorne laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had not laughed in a long time and who had been saving it. No, Ranger, you will watch them die first. Every cowboy who rode for your brand, then your woman, then I will put a bullet in you slow. That is the order. I have thought about the order for 7 years. He drew his pistol. He fired. Cal was already moving. The bullet hit the porch post where his head had been a second before. Cal was off the porch and behind the water trough before the second shot. And then the world came apart. Wade McKenna fired first from the barn roof. One of the riders at the far end of the line jerked and went out of the saddle. Tin Cup fired from the upstairs window, and the heavy Sharp's rifle made a sound like a felled tree, and a second rider crumpled. The half-circle of horsemen broke into chaos. They charged. The yard filled with smoke and sound and the high screaming of horses. Margaret braced her Winchester on the woodpile. She picked her target. A rider was coming around the side of the bunkhouse with a long-barreled pistol raised. She breathed out half a breath. She held. She squeezed. The man slid sideways out of his saddle. She did not let herself feel it. She levered another round. She picked the next target. Whiskey Doyle took a bullet through the meat of his left shoulder. He cursed in Gaelic and Irish and English in the space of 3 seconds and kept firing through the bunkhouse window with his right hand. Tucker Hayes shot a man from the kitchen door with his pistol held in his good hand. The recoil nearly knocked him backward, but the rider fell. Hollis Pike stepped out from the corner of the smokehouse to get a better angle. A rifle cracked from somewhere in the chaos. He fell sideways into the dust and did not move again. In the center of the yard, on a horse that was no longer there, Silas Thorne had been thrown. He was on his feet. He was firing his pistol at the porch, at the windows, at anything that moved. A bullet had clipped his right leg, and he was limping, but he was up. Cal Rourke came out from behind the water trough. He walked straight at Silas Thorne. He did not run. He did not crouch. He walked across the yard in the smoke and the shouting like a man walking across a parlor floor. Silas saw him. Silas turned. They fired at the same time. Silas spun and went down on his bad leg. Cal staggered. A red bloom spread on his right shoulder. He did not fall. He kept walking. He came up to where Silas was lying, and he kicked the pistol out of his hand, and he stood over him with his own pistol pointed at Silas's chest. "It is over," Cal said. "Tell your men." Silas was bleeding from a wound below his ribs. His face was very pale. He smiled up at Cal with bloody teeth. "You always thought you were going to be the one to kill me, Ranger. I am not going to kill you, Silas. You are going to hang in Cheyenne, with your ledger as the evidence." Silas Thorne's eyes shifted past Cal. They focused on something behind him. And then, in a movement that was almost too fast to see, his left hand went down into his boot and came up with a heavy knife with a 6-inch blade, and he lunged upward from the dirt. and he drove the knife at Cal Rourke's belly. A rifle barked from the porch. Silas Thorne stopped. For one long second, he stayed half-risen, the knife 6 inches from Cal's coat. Then the strength went out of him. He sagged. He looked past Cal one more time. He saw her. Margaret Ashford stood on the porch of Rourke's Bend with her Winchester .73 in her hands, and the barrel was smoking in the cold morning air. "Edmund Ashford was my husband," she said. Her voice carried across the yard, very clear, very steady. "And I told myself, Silas Thorne, that I would not let you take another thing from me." He slid down into the dust. He did not get up again. The yard slowly went quiet. The remaining riders, what was left of them, had broken off and were scattering east. Wade McKenna shot one more from the roof of the barn, and the rest disappeared over the ridge. Cal Rourke stood in the middle of the yard, with blood running down his right arm. He turned. He looked at the porch. Margaret was still standing with the rifle. Their eyes met across the yard, through the slow drift of powder smoke. She lowered the rifle. She came down the porch steps and walked across the yard to him, past the fallen men, past the horse with the broken leg that Tucker was already moving toward, to put down, past everything until she was standing in front of him. She reached up and touched the blood on his shoulder. "Cal, sit down, now, before you fall down." He sat down on the bottom porch step. She knelt in front of him. She tore strips from her petticoat. She pressed cloth against the wound. The bullet had gone through cleanly in the meat of his shoulder, missing the bone. "You will live, Cal Rourke." "Maggie." "What? You shot him?" "Yes." "Through the back?" "Yes." He looked at her with something in his eyes she could not name. And then he said, quietly, "Thank you." She kept the cloth pressed to his shoulder. The yard moved around them. The men checked the bodies. Tucker Hayes carried Hollis Pike's hat over to where Tin Cup was kneeling beside Hollis on the ground, and Tin Cup took off his own hat and laid it across Hollis's chest. The young wife in Cheyenne would not know yet. Someone would have to ride down and tell her. Marshal Jed Bishop and 10 federal deputies rode in at sundown. Old Pete had reached Cheyenne. Bishop had not waited for paperwork. He had ridden out in the middle of the night with men he trusted, and a federal warrant in his saddlebag for the arrest of Silas Thorne on charges of trafficking conspiracy and the suspected murder of one Dr. Edmund Ashford of Philadelphia. He arrived in time to collect a body, not a prisoner. He stood with Cal on the porch as the sun went down over the prairie, and he looked out at the line of dead men laid in the yard under canvas, and he said quietly, "I have been waiting 12 years to close this case, Cal." "It is closed, Jed." "What about the ledger?" "It is yours. Take it. 12 doctors are named in it across this country. They have been supplying him for years, some of them under threat, some of them out of greed. They all need to be brought in. The network ends with that book." Bishop nodded. Then he reached into his coat. He took out a small leather pouch. He opened it. From the pouch, he took a silver star dented along one point, tarnished black with age. He held it out to Cal. "I have carried this for 7 years. I picked it up off the calash the day you laid it down. I thought maybe someday you would want it back." Cal looked at the star for a long time. He did not take it. "Jed, I am grateful, but I do not need that piece of tin anymore. I had my justice this morning, not because I shot him, because she did, and the law will hang what is left. Take it to a young man in Texas who still believes a star is what makes the difference. I have a ranch to run. I have a woman to marry. I have a child to raise. I am done with that road." Marshal Jed Bishop closed his hand around the star and put it back in his coat. He nodded once. He understood. He had always understood. They buried Hollis Pike on the small rise behind the main house 3 days later, beside the empty places Cal had marked years before for graves he had not yet been able to fill. The men stood with their hats in their hands. Tin Cup Madsen played a slow, mournful note on his harmonica that did not become a song, just a sound, and a wind from the west moved the long grass. Cal married Margaret Ashford on the 18th of December. There was no church wedding. There was no town dance. There was no white dress. There was a Sunday morning at the front porch of Rourke's Bend, with snow on the ground, and a small gathering of people who had come to mean everything to both of them. Reverend Whitcomb from Cedar Falls rode out in a borrowed buggy and stood on the porch in a black coat with a book in his hand. Amos Briggs came. Widow Halloway came. Marshal Jed Bishop came in his only good suit. Sarah Jane stood at Margaret's side and held a small bunch of dried winter sage in a careful little fist. Tucker Hayes stood at Cal's side as his best man, his arm out of the splint now, but still held a little stiff. Tin Cup and Wade and Whiskey and the rest of the men stood in a half circle on the snowy yard with their hats in their hands. Margaret wore the blue wool dress she had worn to the dance. Cal wore the dark coat and the clean white shirt. Their vows were brief. He said, "Maggie, I have lived 10 years as a ghost of myself. You made me a man again. I will keep my word to you and to this child until the day I am put in the ground." She said, "Cal, I came west to survive. I stayed to live. I do not need anything in this world but your table and your fire and your name." He put a plain gold ring on her finger. It had been his mother's. She put a plain silver band on his. The blacksmith in Cedar Falls had made it. Reverend Whitcomb said the words. The men cheered. Sarah Jane laughed for the first time anyone could remember. That night in the warm kitchen, with the long table full of food and the fire roaring in the cast-iron stove, Tin Cup Madsen lifted his tin cup of coffee, and he stood up at his place, and he said, "To Cal Rourke, to Mrs. Margaret Rourke, to this house, may it never again forget how to laugh." And the men drank. In the spring of 1885, almost a year and a half later, a young man rode up the road into Rourke's Bend in a coat too thin for the wind. He was 19 years old. He had brown hair the same shade as Cal's had been before it went gray. And he had Cal's mother's eyes. He carried a letter in his saddlebag from a lawyer in Amarillo. The letter explained that after the Comanche raid of 1859, Cal's father had survived because he had been in town that day, and that he had eventually remarried to an English widow named Eliza Whitfield, and that they had had a son. The son's name was Eli Rourke. He had been raised in Texas. He had not known about his older half-brother until after the lawyer's letter. He had come north because he had nowhere else to go, and a name he wanted to know. Cal met him in the yard. He looked at the young man for a long time. He saw his mother's eyes. He saw his father's chin. He saw something of himself at 19 when he had not yet laid down anything in the dust. He held out his hand. Eli. Yes, sir. You will sleep in the bunkhouse tonight. Tomorrow we will see about a horse for you. There is work here if you want it. There is family here if you want that more. The young man's eyes filled. He did not let the tears fall. He took Cal's hand. Margaret stood on the porch with her hand on the small, round swell of her stomach. She was 45 years old, and she was carrying a child she had not believed her body would ever carry. And she was watching her husband shake the hand of a brother he had not known existed. Sarah Jane, almost 9 years old now, came running around the corner of the barn, chasing a brown puppy. And she stopped at the sight of the stranger, and she looked up at the man on the porch step. Cal, she said. Who is he? He is your uncle, Sarah Jane. The little girl considered this with the serious gravity of a child who had learned not to ask for too much. All right, she said, and she went back to chasing the puppy. The sun was going down over the prairie. The mountains in the distance were turning the color of beaten copper. Tin Cup. Madsen sat on the porch with his harmonica, and Tucker Hayes, 24 years old, and the foreman of Rourke's Bend, now was leaning on the corral fence laughing at something Wade had said. The smell of beef and onions and fresh bread was coming out of the open kitchen window. Cal Rourke walked up the porch steps to his wife and put his hand on hers where it rested on her belly. Maggie. Yes, Cal. We are going to call him Henry, after Tin Cup, after the man who stayed when no one else had to. She nodded. He turned and looked out over his land. The cattle in the far pasture were small, dark shapes against the gold. The wind moved his hair, which was nearly all gray now at the temples. The slight unevenness of his old wound was still there in his step, and it would always be there, and he had stopped minding it long ago. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. 7 years ago, I laid down a silver star in the dust of Texas. I thought I had died that day. I thought I was just walking around afterward. I see now I was wrong. I see now I was only beginning. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. The lamp came on in the kitchen window behind them, and in the long valley of Rourke's Bend, where the smoke of the chimneys rose straight up in the still cold air, and the laughter of cowboys carried from the bunkhouse, and a small girl chased a puppy in the last gold light of a Wyoming spring. The man who had once been the most feared ranger in Texas stood with his arm around his wife and watched the country go quiet for the night. For some men, the old ones used to say in that part of the country, are born twice in this life, once to fight, once to live. Calvin Rourke had done both.